The fragmentation trap is you had a couple $1,000,000 in media spend. You could in-house programmatic pretty easily. Fast forward to today, 70 to 80% of media spend in any given campaign often goes to search or social. And so all of a sudden to do this in-house isn't profitable. For us, when we talk about Open Garden, it really is access to the full landscape, all the inventory sources, all the technology that's out there, all the data that's out there, so that when you're building media plans and you're trying to make really impactful advertising, you really can make the decisions that are best for the outcomes that you're looking to drive.
Welcome to Inside AI Digital Podcast. I'm your host, YJ. In each episode, we sit down with leaders from AI Digital and across the ad tech industry to talk about how AI is reshaping media strategy and digital activation. In this series, we're exploring AI Digital's Open Garden framework, our perspective on how modern programmatic advertising should be planned, activated, and measured. I'm your host, YJ, and today I'm joined by Tom Burke, our Chief Revenue Officer. He brings more than 20 years of experience across digital media, ad tech, with leadership roles at companies like AOL, Basis, PMG, and Illumin. So welcome to the podcast, Tom.
Yeah, YJ, thank you. I'm excited to be here. Let's do it.
So one thing I found very interesting about our industry is that most of us didn't really, grow up thinking we'd work in ad tech. And today we spend a lot of time engaging with universities and students. But when I was in school, programmatic advertising, RTB, wasn't part of the syllabus. So you've spent more than 2 decades in the space. Could you walk us through your journey in ad tech?
Yeah, the journey for me has been a really interesting one. And I think like all journeys, it kind of goes like this. I graduated college in about 2008. And at the time, digital was really starting to grow exponentially. I had no idea what I wanted to do when I grow up. I still don't. And for me, I was talking to my cousin who worked in advertising, and he said, "Hey, I think it would be really valuable if you try to get into digital." He said at the time, Boston.com was growing really, really fast. Boston Globe is the newspaper in Boston, and they had just launched the digital version. And he essentially said to me, "Hey, if you could get into digital, I think it's going to be a really amazing career for you." I looked up to him, I listened to him, and so I tried really hard to get into digital. I tried really hard to get into Boston Globe at Boston.com. I got the opportunity to go to Hill Holiday, which is an ad agency in Boston. And that's really where I learned the foundation of digital. So that's where I learned how to build a media plan, how to traffic campaigns, really the foundation of everything that digital still is. And from there, like you said, I got some really amazing opportunities. I worked at AOL for a handful of years. And then for me, Basis was really interesting. I joined Basis in about 2012. At the time, Basis was called Centro, and we were solving for fragmentation in the local media space. And we acquired a DSP called Site Scout. I believe it was around 2013, and that's really when I got into programmatic. And so, I remember vividly Googling what is a DSP, what's an SSP, right? What's real time bidding. And from there, I've stayed in ever since, and I love it. I've since had experience at, like you said, PMG. And so my experience really is publisher side, agency side, ad tech side. And so it gives me a really interesting view of the landscape.
That's amazing. It sounds like you have a very comprehensive experience across publication, agency, as well as ad tech, which is something unique, right? Some of us just spend so much time in ad tech or on the agency side or the brand side. So it's really cool to hear. And speaking of kind of the advertising landscape, it's really become over time very concentrated around a handful of marketing platforms. And oftentimes we refer to them as walled gardens, right? And lately we've been hearing more about the idea of the open garden. So how would you define an open garden and what it represents in contrast to the walled garden model that has really dominated the digital advertising landscape over the years?
Yeah. So walled gardens, I just talked about my career. When I started in 2008, it was actually the landscape was so different, but the challenges that marketers faced were actually really similar. So if I go back to 2008, most media dollars were being consolidated to two really large partners. No, at that time, those two large partners were AOL and Yahoo. They got almost all the dollars. Um, So there were two big walled gardens in 2008 that were taking a lot of the budget. Marketers were then trying to adjust to emerging platforms. At that point, those emerging platforms were things like Facebook and Twitter had just really popped and had really started to take some market share. And they were also dealing with a ton of fragmentation. In 2008, that fragmentation was largely local media publications. There were thousands of them that were really hard to navigate. Fast forward to today, those challenges still exist, just in different platforms. So the media consolidation now is within Google and Meta largely. So that's still two or three publications that are taking the majority of dollars still exists. You've got changes in media consumption habits with things like AI and people testing new platforms and marketers trying to figure out how do I evolve to that. And then instead of local media fragmentation, you have this DSP fragmentation and you have fragmentation within the programmatic ecosystem. So to answer your questions, these walled gardens, every platform is trying to figure out how to differentiate themselves. And so many of it do it by owning inventory or owning data, and then they wall that off. And so to get a full view of the ecosystem is really difficult because you have to be in 10, 15, 20 platforms to see it all. And that's the vision for Open Garden. For us, when we talk about Open Garden, it really is access to the full landscape. So it's access to all the inventory sources, all the technology that's out there, all the data that's out there, so that when you're building media plans and you're trying to make really impactful advertising, you're not restricted by the walls that the walled gardens put in. You really can make the decisions that are best for the outcomes that you're looking to drive.
I love that. You talk a lot about fragmentation. You recently wrote a piece on Forbes called "The Fragmentation Trap," right? And I've had a chance to read, and it's a great piece, by the way. You
Thank you.
talk a lot about marketers having to juggle multiple platforms, identity systems, measurement frameworks, and you mentioned a challenge with having a full view of the ecosystem. So, can you talk a little bit about the idea of the fragmentation trap and how the open garden approach helps marketer regain some of that visibility and control?
Yeah, the fragmentation trap it's really interesting, and I think it's really emerged over the last, I'd say, 18 to 24 months. Um, when you think about a marketer, whether that's an agency or brand, there was this big pendulum shift to in-housing, probably like call it 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Everyone wanted to in-house media. And people had done it with search and social. And so the next logical step was let's do it with programmatic. And for a long time, it worked really well. Like the DSPs in the market had access to the same inventory, they had access to the same data, and so if you had a couple $1,000,000 in media spend, you could in-house programmatic pretty easily. You go get a DSP, you have a MSA with that DSP, you build a partnership, you train some traders who are usually at the time search and social traders, then became programmatic traders. It wasn't that hard. I shouldn't say that. There was a lot of complexities, but it was doable for most marketers. Fast forward to today, there's dozens of DSPs. They all do something different. They all wall off their inventory and data or unique measurement solutions. And so to do media really well, you need access to probably at a minimum 4 to 6 DSPs. Now, the challenge with this, if you look at the way that media spend usually falls, 70 to 80% of media spend in any given campaign often goes to search or social, depending on the KPIs. Search and social only has a couple platforms. It's actually really easy to do in house, and Google and Meta are continuing to automate. Say 20% of that budget goes to programmatic. That 20% is incredibly fragmented, and you have to run it across 5, 6 partners. And so all of a sudden, to do this in house isn't profitable. And so that pendulum that swung to in-housing, we're now seeing start to swing back to strategic partnerships. And I think these strategic partnerships and the best agencies that I see are doing a little bit of both. Some of them are doing some things in-house, some are working with strategic partnerships, and just being agile is incredibly important. And so when I talk about the fragmentation trap, that's what I mean. You're trying to take a budget in programmatic that is spreading really thin across 5, 6, 7 partners, and it's diluting what you're trying to do. And at the end of the day, you're not getting a holistic view of your customer either. And so it's really, really challenging right now.
I totally agree. And I was part of that in-housing, movement 10 years back on the agency side, bringing in, or at least trying to bring in a lot of that ad tech in-house. And totally agree how complicated and complex it may be.
Yeah, and I was too, and I still think there's so much value there when it's for the right partner. And I think now to in-house properly, we were just talking with our COO recently, and she estimated that you probably need $20 million in media spend to do it effectively, right? And so to go from being able to do it profitably with a few million bucks to needing upwards of 20, all of a sudden that jump is really difficult. And so I still, I'm not against in-housing by any means. I think it's just making the right decisions for the business to make sure that you have access to everything you need from an inventory standpoint, a data standpoint, a measurement standpoint, and that's really challenging for most partners.
Absolutely. For some of our listeners who may be going through that challenge, whether they're on the brand side or the agency side, what are a few, practical things that they can take away or start doing over the next year to take, better advantage of the open garden and avoid being too dependent on just a small number of platforms?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and this goes with, and I know that this isn't the topic we're talking about, but it really goes with the shift to AI as well. This would be my general perspective across both of those things, which is stay really curious and just educate as best as you can on what's in the market. And so, I'd say my biggest advice is to go educate yourself on what is out there, what lives behind walled gardens, what doesn't, how are consumers' attentions changing so that you can really make meaningful connections between your brand and the consumer, and then find solutions, right? Like that's our goal. Our goal is to bring a solution to our partners to say, hey, we can help you get access to all this inventory and all this data and all these platforms and help you look holistically across the top through our approach. There's of course other solutions out there, but to find a good solution that works for your business is incredibly important.
That's a really interesting point, Tom, because as we know, like you said, oftentimes the platforms are described to be a commodity, but we know we set up the same test within different DSPs. Or matter of fact, ask the same questions across different LLMs. Every time we're going to get a different response or different recommendation. So completely agree that we have to continue and test different platforms and make sure we're not relying on just a handful of them.
Completely. Yep, completely.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you something a little different. Um, Alongside your career in ad tech, you're also a children's book author,
Oh,
which
yeah.
which is not a typical crossover we see in the industry. So, what has inspired you to start writing children's book, and has the storytelling influenced how you communicate in business and in leadership?
Oh, that's funny. I love that question. So, so I always said I wanted to write a children's book. It was just something that growing up I always joked about, like, oh, I'd love to do that one day. When COVID hit, I never really knew what I wanted to write about. And when COVID hit, as we were coming out of COVID, I watched my kids come back into the world, and they come back to do all these new experiences. And when they did, they were really nervous. So, like, at first, they'd go come back and they would get really nervous about doing something for the first time again. And then once they did it, they were fine, right? And I thought that that's such an interesting thing. And I think it's still really valid for adults, right? Like the first time you record a podcast, the first time you present in front of a client, the first time that you take a stage, you get nervous, right? And the more you do it, the more it becomes normal. And so I took this theory and that's what I wrote about. It's all about gaining confidence through experiences. It's essentially four animal friends who are playing in a forest. The main character gets nervous trying new things, and then her friend encourages her to try them. She does them. She gains confidence through the experiences, and then they go explore. They try new things. They have new experiences, and so it's been really fun. Um, I still go to my kids' school every year and read to the kindergartners and the first graders coming in. I love to mail them out. So if anyone listening to this wants a copy, shoot me a note. I'll mail one out. And then I actually have these fun. I have these fun stuffed animals. That's one of the characters too. And so it's just been a fun. It's been a little fun side hobby. As far as communication goes, I think for me it's just a fun way to build a connection with someone. Anyone who reads it, anyone who kids get it, they shoot me texts, and I love seeing that stuff. So it's been really fun.
It's an incredible story, and it's such a a simple yet effective concept, right? I always remind myself like confidence comes from experience to make sure I don't get ahead of myself. So I love that.
Yeah, and the interesting thing for me is most people say to themselves, "I need the confidence to go do this thing," right? Whatever that is. Like once I am ready to do it, I'm gonna go do it. In reality, you're never really ready. You gain the confidence and you get ready by doing the things, right? And so everyone always talks about pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, and this is kind of a microcosm of that. I think there's a lot of validity to that.
Tom, thanks again for joining us and sharing your perspective. And to everyone listening, we've got great conversations ahead in the series. So stay tuned for the next episode.
Awesome. Thank you, IJ. This was great. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom.
Bye.